The freezing wind howled through the cracks of the weathered barn like a hungry wolf as Florence Hartley crouched deeper into the shadows. Her wedding dress, once pristine white, now mudded and torn at the hem. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, partly from the biting cold of the Montana winter of 1885, and partly from the terror of what she had just done. She had run. Left William Blackwood, son of the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory, standing at the altar before God and half the county. Florence pulled the woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, knowing full well the consequences of her actions would be severe if she were found. The sound of approaching footsteps made her blood run cold. Heavy boots crunched on the frost-hardened ground outside, growing louder with each step. Florence pressed herself against the rough wooden wall behind a stack of hay bales, willing herself to disappear. The barn door creaked open, sending a shaft of pale moonlight across the dirt floor. A tall silhouette filled the doorway, broad-shouldered and imposing. "I know someone's in here," a deep voice called out. "Might as well show yourself. I ain't one for games, especially not on a night cold enough to freeze the horns off a bull." Florence remained still, barely breathing. The man sighed and lifted a lantern, its glow illuminating a weathered face with a strong jawline, dark eyes, and several days' worth of stubble. "Look, I'm not aiming to hurt you, but this is my property, and I'd prefer knowing who's hiding in my barn." With nowhere left to run and the cold seeping into her bones, Florence slowly stood up, hay clinging to her ruined dress. The man's eyes widened in surprise, his gaze taking in her bedraggled appearance, the torn wedding dress, the blue lips, the trembling limbs. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "You're shaking something fierce, miss. Please," Florence whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Please don't tell anyone I'm here." The man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. Then he shrugged off his heavy coat and held it out to her. "Name's Preston Reid," he said quietly. "And it seems to me like you could use a warm fire and a hot meal more than anything else right now." As Florence hesitantly stepped forward to accept the coat, neither of them could have possibly known how their lives would forever be changed by this chance encounter on a bitter cold Montana night. "Thank you," Florence whispered, slipping her arms into the oversized coat that smelled of tobacco, pine, and honest work. The warmth of it, Preston's warmth, enveloped her immediately. "Can't leave a lady freezing in my barn, now can I?" Preston replied, his eyes darting to her wedding dress. "Though I reckon there's quite a story behind why you're here instead of wherever that dress was meant to take you." Florence lowered her gaze. "I made a terrible mistake. Getting married or running away from it?" Preston asked, a hint of wry humor in his voice. Despite everything, Florence found herself smiling slightly. "The former, running, was the only sensible thing I've done today," Preston nodded, not pressing further. "Come on to the house. Questions can wait until you're warmed up." He led her across the moonlit yard to a modest but well-built cabin. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. Preston opened the door, and Florence nearly wept at the rush of heat that greeted her. The cabin's interior was simple but tidy, a far cry from the opulent Blackwood mansion she'd fled. A fire crackled in the hearth, illuminating a wooden table, a few chairs, shelves lined with books, and a bed in the corner with a colorful quilt. "It ain't much," Preston said, almost apologetically, "but it's home." "It's wonderful," Florence replied honestly. Preston busied himself stoking the fire and putting a pot of coffee on the stove. "Sit by the fire. I'll find you something dry to change into." Florence sank gratefully into a chair near the hearth, extending her frozen fingers toward the flames. She watched as Preston rummaged through a trunk, eventually producing a flannel shirt and a pair of trousers. "These'll be too big, but they're clean and dry," he said, placing them on the table. "There's a screen in the corner you can change behind. I'll step outside to check on the horses and give you some privacy." "You're very kind, Mr. Reid." A flush that had nothing to do with the fire crept up his neck. "Preston, please, and it's nothing any decent man wouldn't do." After he'd gone, Florence quickly changed behind the screen, grateful to be free of the sodden wedding dress. The flannel shirt hung to her knees, and she had to roll the trousers up several times, but the clothes were warm and soft against her skin. When Preston returned, he paused momentarily at the sight of her in his clothes, standing by the fire with her long auburn hair falling loose around her shoulders. He cleared his throat and averted his eyes, moving to pour 2 cups of coffee. "Thank you," Florence said, accepting the steaming mug. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me." "Frozen solid, most likely," Preston replied matter-of-factly. "We're expecting snow tonight," Florence shuddered. "I wasn't thinking clearly when I ran, I just knew I couldn't marry him." Preston regarded her thoughtfully. "You want to tell me about it, not that you owe me any explanations, but sometimes talking helps." Florence hesitated, then sank back into the chair. "My name is Florence Hartley. I was supposed to marry William Blackwood this afternoon." Preston's eyebrows shot up. "Blackwood?" "As in Harold Blackwood's son," she nodded. "The very same. My father works for Mr. Blackwood, manages his accounts. The marriage was arranged to settle a debt." Preston's jaw tightened. "Your father sold you to settle a debt." "He didn't see it that way," Florence said softly. "The Blackwoods are powerful. William took an interest in me at a dinner last spring. My father saw it as an opportunity for our family to rise in society." "And what did you see it as?" Florence stared into the fire. "A prison sentence. William is cruel. He hides it well in public, but I've seen how he treats those he considers beneath him. His servants, his horses." She shuddered. "He once beat a stable boy unconscious for saddling the wrong horse." Preston's hand tightened around his coffee mug. "And your father still expected you to marry such a man." "My father sees only what he wishes to see," Florence replied bitterly. "The Blackwood fortune, the Blackwood name. When I expressed doubts, he reminded me of my duty to my family." She gave a hollow laugh. "So I stood at the altar today, ready to sacrifice myself like some biblical lamb, and then, I just couldn't, so you ran." "So I ran," Florence confirmed. "In the confusion of my departure, I managed to get away. I've been hiding, moving from place to place all day. I had no plan beyond escape." Preston was quiet for a long moment. "The Blackwoods won't take this slight lightly?" "No," Florence agreed, fear creeping back into her voice. "They won't. They'll be searching for you." "Yes." Preston sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "Well, they won't be searching my property tonight, not with the snow coming. You're safe until morning at least." Relief washed over Florence. "I can leave at first light. I don't want to bring trouble to your door." "And go where exactly?" Preston asked. When Florence had no answer, he continued, "Get some rest tonight. We'll figure something out tomorrow." He stood and moved to the bed, stripping off the quilt and a pillow. "You take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Preston said firmly. "You've had a hard enough day without adding sleeping on the floor to it." As Florence sank gratefully onto the bed, exhaustion finally overtaking her, she watched Preston arrange his makeshift bed by the hearth. In the firelight, she could see the strong lines of his profile, the gentleness in hands that were clearly accustomed to hard work. "Preston," she murmured sleepily. "Why are you helping me?" He glanced over at her, his expression softening. "Get some sleep, Florence. Tomorrow will come soon enough." As she drifted off to sleep, Florence couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so safe, or the last time anyone had looked at her the way Preston had, like she was a person worth helping, not a possession to be bartered or claimed. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, blanketing the world in silence. Morning came with blinding whiteness. Florence woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows, reflecting off snow that had fallen heavily during the night. For a moment she was disoriented, then the events of the previous day came flooding back. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the cabin. Preston stood at the stove, his back to her, humming softly as he cooked. He'd already been outside, his coat was dusted with melting snow. "Good morning," Florence said, sitting up. Preston turned, a smile warming his face. "Morning, thought you might sleep till noon, considering what you've been through." "What time is it?" "Just past 8, he replied, sliding eggs onto a plate. "Hope you're hungry." Florence's stomach growled in response, making them both laugh. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten, certainly not yesterday, when her nerves had made food impossible. "How bad is the snow?" she asked, accepting the plate he offered. "About 2 feet and still coming down," Preston replied, sitting across from her with his own breakfast. "No one's traveling today, that's for certain." Florence tried to hide her relief. Another day before she had to figure out what came next. "So," Preston said after they'd eaten in companionable silence for a few minutes, "I've been thinking about your situation." Florence tensed. "I'll be gone as soon as the weather permits. I promise I won't be a burden." Preston shook his head. "That's not what I meant. I'm wondering where you plan to go. The Blackwoods have connections throughout the territory. They'll be looking for you." "I know," Florence sighed. "I thought perhaps I could make it to Helena, find work there." "As what?" Preston asked gently. "Not trying to be unkind, but what skills do you have?" Florence bristled slightly. "I can read and write. I'm good with figures. I helped my father with the Blackwood accounts. I can cook." She trailed off, seeing Preston's point. Her education, while better than many women's, had been entirely focused on making her a suitable wife, not an independent woman. "The Blackwoods will check the stagecoach stations, the train depot," Preston continued. "You wouldn't make it 10 miles before they found you." "What would you have me do then?" Florence asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "Go back and marry a man who terrifies me?" "No," Preston said firmly. "Never that." He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I have a proposition for you." Florence regarded him warily. Her experiences with men's propositions had not been positive. Seeming to read her thoughts, Preston held up his hands. "Nothing improper. I'm suggesting a business arrangement of sorts." "What kind of arrangement?" "I need help around here," Preston explained. "I've got 60 acres, a small herd of cattle, chickens, 2 horses, and more work than one man can handle. Spring's coming, which means calving season, planting the kitchen garden, repairs from winter damage." "You're offering me employment?" Florence asked, surprised. "I'm offering you sanctuary," Preston corrected. "Food, shelter, and yes, work. The Blackwoods know me only as one of many small ranchers in the area. They have no reason to search here specifically. And in return, like I said, help with the ranch." "You mentioned you can cook. That alone would be worth your keep. I've been living on my own, cooking for too long." He smiled ruefully. "But I understand if you'd rather take your chances elsewhere." Florence considered his offer. Preston was essentially a stranger, yet he'd shown her nothing but kindness. The alternative was striking out alone in a world where the Blackwoods' influence was far-reaching. "How long?" she asked finally. "Until you decide what you want to do next," Preston said. "A week, a month. However long you need." Florence studied him, trying to discern his true motives. His brown eyes met hers steadily, without guile. "Why would you do this for me?" Preston was quiet for a moment. 10 years ago, I was in trouble. Someone helped me when they didn't have to. I swore I'd do the same if I ever got the chance." He shrugged. "Besides, I meant what I said about needing help around here." Florence thought about William Blackwood's cold eyes, his controlling hands, the future that had awaited her as his wife. Then she looked at Preston's simple cabin, at the honest work it represented. "I accept your offer," she said. "Though I'm not sure how much help I'll actually be." Preston smiled, relief evident in his expression. "We'll figure it out together." And so began Florence Hartley's new life on Preston Reid's small ranch, hidden away from the world that sought to claim her. The first week passed in a blur of adjustment. Florence had never lived in such rustic conditions, but she found herself adapting more easily than expected. Preston was patient, showing her how to tend the chickens, explaining the rhythm of ranch life, never making her feel inadequate when she struggled with a new task. For his part, Preston couldn't remember when he'd last enjoyed simple conversations so much. Florence was well-read and quick-witted, making even mundane chores more pleasant. And true to her word, her cooking was a vast improvement over his own. They developed a routine. Mornings began early with coffee by the fire before tackling the day's chores. Evenings were spent reading aloud from Preston's small collection of books or simply talking by the hearth. They kept a cautious eye on visitors. Twice, riders from neighboring ranches stopped by, and Florence retreated to the loft until they departed. No one mentioned a search for a runaway bride, but they couldn't be too careful. On the 10th day, as they sat shelling peas at the kitchen table, Preston broached a subject that had been on his mind. "We should come up with a story," he said. "For who you are, I mean. Can't keep hiding you every time someone comes calling." Florence nodded thoughtfully. "What do you suggest?" "Could say you're my cousin, come to help after losing your husband," Preston mused. "Would explain why no one's seen you before." "A widow," Florence said, testing the idea. "Yes, that could work, but we'd need to match our stories." "Where would I be from?" "Kansas," Preston decided. "I have family there, though none nearby. You could be my mother's sister's daughter." "And my late husband, farmer, fever took him last winter." Florence nodded, committing the details to memory. "And my name, Hartley isn't common around here, but the Blackwoods might hear of it." Preston considered this. "Florence is distinctive too. How about Faye Wilson?" "Faye Wilson," Florence repeated. "Yes, I can remember that." "Good." "The spring social's coming up in 3 weeks. Might be a good place to introduce you to folks. By then, the Blackwoods might have eased their search a bit." Florence's hands stilled. "Is that wise? What if someone recognizes me?" "Most folks around here wouldn't have been invited to a Blackwood wedding," Preston reasoned. "And it's good to establish you as part of the community. Makes you less suspicious than a woman no one ever sees." Though nervous about the idea, Florence saw the logic in it. "Very well. Faye Wilson it is." As they returned to shelling peas, Florence found herself studying Preston's hands, strong and calloused, yet gentle with everything they touched. More and more, she was noticing such things about him. The way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he smiled, how he hummed when he was thinking, the respect with which he treated every living thing on his ranch. Preston, meanwhile, was growing accustomed to Florence's presence in a way that both comforted and unsettled him. He enjoyed watching her gather eggs in the morning sunlight, hair gleaming copper, or the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating on a task. She brought life and warmth to his solitary existence, but he reminded himself sternly that she was there out of necessity, not choice. Once she felt safe, she would surely move on to the life she deserved, one with more prospects than a struggling rancher could offer. Neither spoke of these thoughts, and the days continued to pass in a harmony that felt increasingly natural to them both. The 3rd week brought the first true signs of spring crocuses pushing through the melting snow, longer days, the arrival of the first calves. Florence found herself delighting in these changes, so different from the carefully manicured gardens and artificial rhythms of her previous life. One afternoon, as she hung laundry on the line behind the cabin, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Glancing toward the road, her heart froze. 2 riders were approaching, and even at a distance, she recognized the Blackwood brand on their horses. Abandoning the laundry, Florence slipped quickly into the barn where Preston was mending tack. "Riders coming," she whispered urgently. "Blackwood men." Preston's expression hardened. "Get up to the loft and stay quiet. I'll handle this." Florence climbed the ladder to the hayloft, positioning herself where she could see through a small gap in the boards. Preston stepped outside, casually wiping his hands on a rag as the riders approached. "Afternoon," he called, his posture relaxed though Florence could see the tension in his shoulders. The riders reined in. Florence recognized one as Silas Turner, William Blackwood's foreman, a man whose cruelty rivaled his employer's. "Reid," Turner acknowledged with a curt nod. "We're looking for someone. Runaway woman. Harold Blackwood's offering $100 for information leading to her return." Preston raised his eyebrows, the picture of mild interest. "That's so, what'd she do?" "Left Blackwood's son at the altar," the second rider supplied. "Humiliated the family something fierce." "That right," Preston leaned against the fence post. Can't say I've seen any strange women around. Got a description. Auburn hair, green eyes. Pretty thing, about 22, name's Florence Hartley, Turner said, watching Preston carefully. Might be wearing a wedding dress or might have stolen other clothes by now. Preston frowned thoughtfully. Nope, haven't seen anyone like that. Been pretty quiet around here, just me and the cattle, but I'll keep an eye out. Turner studied the ranch, his gaze passing over the cabin, the barn, the washing on the line. Florence held her breath when his eyes lingered on a dress she'd altered from one of Preston's old shirts. That your laundry, Reid? Turner asked with a smirk. Didn't figure you for the domestic type. Preston chuckled easily. My cousin's staying with me for a spell. Her husband passed last winter back in Kansas. She's helping out around the place. That right? Turner's eyes narrowed. Don't recall you mentioning family before. Don't recall you asking, Preston replied, a harder edge entering his voice. Something else I can help you with, Turner? The foreman seemed about to press further when the second rider interrupted. We should keep moving, Silas. Still got the Johnson and Miller places to check before dark. Turner gave Preston a last, suspicious look. You see anything, Reid, you let us know. Blackwoods don't take kindly to those who interfere in family matters. I'll keep that in mind, Preston said evenly. Only when the riders had disappeared down the road did Preston return to the barn. Florence climbed down from the loft, her legs shaky. They're looking for me, she whispered. $100, that's more than most men around here see in months. It won't matter, Preston assured her. No one who knows the Blackwoods would cross them for money. And those who don't know them wouldn't recognize you anyway. Turner was suspicious about the laundry. Let him be suspicious. He has no proof and I've given him a perfectly reasonable explanation. Preston touched her arm gently, but we should be more careful. From now on, stay closer to the buildings when you're outside. Florence nodded, but the encounter had shaken her. That night, as they sat by the fire, she voiced the thought that had been troubling her all afternoon. Perhaps I should leave after all. I'm putting you at risk by staying here. Preston looked up from the book he'd been reading. Is that what you want, to leave? No, Florence admitted softly, but I couldn't bear it if you suffered because of me. I'm not suffering, Preston said with a small smile. In fact, I'd say my life's improved considerably since you arrived. The food alone is worth any risk. His attempt at humor eased some of her tension. I'm serious, Preston. So am I, he replied, closing his book. Look, the Blackwoods can't search forever. Eventually they'll accept that you're gone and move on. William will find another bride, one whose family needs the connection badly enough to overlook his nature. And in the meantime, you're safe here, Preston said firmly. I promised you sanctuary and I meant it. Florence studied him in the firelight, overwhelmed by his steadfastness. Thank you, she said simply. Knowing the words were inadequate, Preston held her gaze for a long moment, then cleared his throat and returned to his book. But Florence noticed how his eyes remained fixed on the same page for the rest of the evening. The spring social arrived on a perfect April day, warm sunshine, wildflowers blooming in the meadows, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of new growth. Despite her nervousness, Florence found herself looking forward to the event. She'd been at the ranch for nearly a month now with only Preston for company. They had prepared carefully. Florence wore her altered dress, now dyed a soft blue, with her hair pinned up in a modest style appropriate for a widow. Preston had polished his boots, trimmed his beard, and donned his one good shirt. As they rode into town together on Preston's wagon, Florence mentally rehearsed her story once more. The social was held in the town's meeting hall, decorated with spring flowers and ribbons. Tables of food lined one wall and a small band played in the corner. As they entered, Florence felt curious eyes turn their way. Preston Reid, a plump, friendly-looking woman, approached them. We'd nearly given up on seeing you at these gatherings. Mrs. Holloway, Preston greeted her with a smile. May I introduce my cousin, Fay Wilson? Fay, this is Mrs. Holloway, our postmistress and the heart of Pinecrest. Pleased to meet you, dear, Mrs. Holloway said warmly. "We don't often get newcomers. How long will you be staying with us?" "I'm not certain," Florence replied. "Preston has kindly taken me in after my husband's passing." "Oh, you poor thing," Mrs. Holloway said with genuine sympathy. "Well, you've come to the right place. Pinecrest is a fine community, and Preston here is one of our most respected ranchers, despite his tendency to keep to himself." Preston shifted uncomfortably at the praise. "Faye's been a great help at the ranch," he said. "Don't know how I managed before she came." Mrs. Holloway's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Is that so? Well, I must introduce you to the others, Faye. Come along." For the next hour, Florence was guided around the room, meeting what seemed like the entire population of Pinecrest. She kept her story simple, answering questions about her late husband and Kansas with carefully prepared details. Preston stayed nearby, occasionally joining conversations but mostly watching Florence with a mixture of admiration and concern. She handled herself beautifully, he thought. No one would suspect she was anything but the grieving widow she claimed to be. "Your cousin's lovely," a voice said at his elbow. Preston turned to find Thomas Cooper, the town's doctor, beside him, and quite educated from the sound of it. "Her father believed in learning," Preston replied, which was true enough from what Florence had told him. "She seems to be fitting in well," Cooper observed. "Mrs. Holloway has already recruited her for the church quilting circle," Preston chuckled. "That didn't take long, it never does." Cooper sipped his punch. "It's good to see you with family, Preston. You've been alone too long." Before Preston could respond, a commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. William Blackwood strode into the hall, flanked by two men including Silas Turner. The room quieted immediately, conversations halting as people turned to look at the unexpected guests. Preston instinctively moved toward Florence, who had gone pale. He reached her side just as William's cold gaze swept the room. "Don't panic," Preston murmured. "Act natural. Remember, you're Faye Wilson." Florence nodded almost imperceptibly, forcing herself to breathe normally. William had never attended a Pinecrest social before the small farming community was beneath the Blackwoods' notice. His presence could not be coincidence. William approached Mayor Daniels, speaking too quietly for others to hear. The mayor looked surprised, then nodded and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "Mr. Blackwood is searching for a missing young woman, his fiancée, who disappeared several weeks ago. He'd like to say a few words." William stepped forward, his handsome face set in an expression of concern that Florence knew to be entirely false. "Thank you for allowing me to interrupt your celebration," he said smoothly. "As some of you may have heard, my fiancée, Florence Hartley, disappeared on our wedding day. We fear she may have been confused or unwell. My family is deeply concerned for her safety." He gestured, and Turner handed him something. Florence's heart sank as she recognized it, a sketch of her face, remarkably accurate. "We're offering a reward of $200 for information leading to her safe return," William continued, holding up the sketch for all to see. "If anyone has seen this woman, please come forward. We only want to ensure her well-being." The crowd murmured, examining the sketch with interest. $200 was a fortune to most of them. Florence felt exposed, certain that at any moment someone would point to her and call out her true identity. Preston moved slightly, positioning himself between Florence and William's line of sight. "Keep calm," he whispered. "No one here knows you as Florence." "What if someone sees the resemblance?" she whispered back. "Then we'll deal with it. For now, smile and act like this has nothing to do with you." Florence forced a small smile, though her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure others must hear it. Across the room, Mrs. Holloway was examining the sketch with a frown. "Never seen her," called out a farmer from the back. "But I'll keep an eye out for that reward," others laughed, and several voiced similar sentiments. William's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "The young lady may have changed her appearance," he added. "She has distinctive green eyes and speaks with an educated accent." More murmurs, and Florence felt the weight of curious glances. Preston squeezed her arm reassuringly. Thank you for your attention, William concluded. My men will leave copies of this sketch with your mayor. Please send word to Blackwood Ranch if you have any information. As William and his men moved to leave, Mrs. Holloway approached them, sketch in hand. Florence's breath caught as the postmistress glanced between the drawing and her face. For a terrible moment, recognition seemed to dawn in the older woman's eyes, but then Mrs. Holloway turned to William with a polite smile. I do hope you find your fiancé, Mr. Blackwood. Must be dreadful not knowing where she is. Indeed, William replied stiffly. Good day, madam. As the Blackwood party departed, the social gradually returned to its previous festive atmosphere. The band resumed playing, conversations restarted, and Florence felt she could breathe again. That was close, she whispered to Preston. He nodded grimly. Too close. Mrs. Holloway recognized you. You think so? I know so, but she chose not to say anything. Preston glanced toward the postmistress, who was now chatting with the mayor's wife. Question is why? Perhaps she didn't see the resemblance after all. Preston shook his head. No, she saw it. Martha Holloway doesn't miss much. Before they could discuss it further, Mrs. Holloway herself approached them, her expression unreadable. Faye, dear, she said cheerfully. I was just telling the ladies about your skill with sewing. We could use help with the church banners if you're interested. Yes, of course, Florence stammered, uncertain how to interpret this seemingly normal conversation. Wonderful, and Preston, Jacob Miller was looking for you, something about trading for that bull of yours. Mrs. Holloway patted Florence's arm. You two enjoy the rest of the social. Such a lovely event, don't you think? As she bustled away, Preston and Florence exchanged bewildered glances. I don't understand, Florence said quietly, if she recognized me. I think, Preston said slowly, we may have more allies than we realized. The remainder of the social passed without incident. If anyone else had noticed Florence's resemblance to the sketch, they gave no indication. By the time Preston and Florence departed for the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the road. Why would Mrs. Holloway protect me? Florence asked as they rode home. She doesn't even know me. Preston was quiet for a moment, considering. The Blackwoods aren't well loved for all their money and power. They've bought up struggling farms, raised grazing fees, controlled water rights. And there are rumors about William, the sort that make people wary. What kind of rumors? That his temper isn't limited to servants and animals, Preston said grimly. His first fiancée 3 years back, Caroline Matthews. Story goes she broke off the engagement suddenly, then her family packed up and left the territory within a week. No goodbyes, no explanation. Florence shivered, remembering the cold fury in William's eyes when she'd once questioned one of his commands. I believe it. Folks around here mind their own business generally, but they look after their own too. Preston glanced at her. And like it or not, as my cousin, you're now one of us. The simple statement warmed Florence in a way she hadn't expected. One of us. She'd never truly felt that sense of belonging, not in her father's house where she was an asset to be managed, and certainly not in the Blackwood world where she would have been merely a possession. Thank you for taking me today, she said softly. Despite the scare with William, I enjoyed myself. Preston smiled, the setting sun highlighting the strong lines of his profile. I'm glad. And I meant what I told Mrs. Holloway. You've been a great help at the ranch. I don't know how I managed before you came. The simple compliment pleased Florence more than any of William Blackwood's elaborate flatteries ever had. As they rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, she realized something had fundamentally shifted between them. They were no longer merely a fugitive and her protector, but something more, partners, perhaps. Friends, certainly. And if her heart quickened when Preston helped her down from the wagon, his strong hands at her waist, his face close to hers in the gathering twilight, well, that was a complication she wasn't ready to examine just yet. The weeks following the social brought a rhythm to Florence's days that she found deeply satisfying. Mornings were for household tasks, cooking, cleaning, tending the kitchen garden she'd established. Afternoons often found her helping Preston with ranch work, learning skills she'd never imagined mastering, mending fences, caring for livestock, even assisting with the birth of calves. Evenings were her favorite shared meals, conversations by the fire, reading aloud from Preston's growing collection of books, supplemented now by loans from Mrs. Holloway, who had indeed taken Florence under her wing. Spring blossomed fully into early summer. Florence's fear of discovery gradually eased as weeks passed with no sign of the Blackwoods in Pinecrest. She began accompanying Preston to town occasionally, growing more comfortable in her role as Fay Wilson, grieving widow and cousin. Preston, watching Florence flourish in this new life, found himself increasingly captivated by her. Her intelligence, her determination to learn every aspect of ranch work, her genuine kindness all combined to create a woman unlike any he'd known. Sometimes he caught himself staring at her as she worked in the garden, dirt smudged on her cheek, hair escaping its pins, looking more beautiful to him than she ever had in her fine dresses. But he kept these thoughts to himself. Florence had come to him seeking safety, not romance. The last thing she needed was pressure from the man providing her sanctuary. Florence, for her part, was experiencing her own confusion. Her feelings for Preston had grown far beyond gratitude or friendship. She found herself noticing small details about him, the way sunlight brought out gold flecks in his brown eyes, how his rare, full laugh transformed his usually serious face, the gentleness of his calloused hands when tending an injured animal. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the meadow, Florence finally broached a subject that had been on her mind. "Preston," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about my situation." He tensed slightly beside her. "Oh. It's been nearly 3 months since I ran away. I can't continue imposing on your hospitality indefinitely." "You're not imposing," Preston said quickly. "I told you before, having you here has been good for me, for the ranch. Even so, I need to consider my future." Florence took a deep breath. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned that the school in Clearwater is seeking a teacher for the fall term. She thinks I would be qualified." Preston was silent for a long moment. "Clearwater's a good town," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "bigger than Pinecrest. Probably has more opportunities for a woman of your education." "Yes," Florence agreed, trying to ignore the disappointment she felt at his response. What had she expected? That he would ask her to stay? "It's far enough from here that the Blackwoods' influence might not reach." "When would you need to leave?" Preston asked, still not looking at her. "The position begins in September. I would need to apply soon and relocate by late August." Florence hesitated. Unless you feel I'm still needed here." It was an opening, a chance for Preston to give her a reason to stay, but he seemed not to recognize it, or perhaps chose not to acknowledge it. "You've more than repaid any debt you might have felt," he said, his voice gruff. "You should do what's best for your future, Florence." The use of her real name, which he rarely spoke aloud even in private, underscored the seriousness of the conversation. Florence felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with fear of the Blackwoods. "I'll write to the school board tomorrow then," she said softly. Preston nodded, his profile rigid in the fading light. "I'll take you to town in the morning. You can post it from there." They sat in silence after that, watching darkness claim the land, each lost in thoughts they couldn't bring themselves to share. The following weeks brought attention to the ranch that hadn't existed before. Florence and Preston maintained their routines, working together efficiently, conversing politely, but something had changed. A distance had grown between them, as if they were already preparing for the separation to come. Florence received a positive response from the Clearwater School Board, inviting her to interview in person. Preston offered to drive her the 20 miles to Clearwater, and they made the journey in uncomfortable silence. The interview went well. The board members were impressed with Florence's knowledge and poise, and by the end of the meeting, she had been offered the position. She would begin teaching in September, with lodging provided in a small house near the school. On the ride back to the ranch, Preston finally spoke more than the bare minimum for the first time that day. "Congratulations," he said, genuinely pleased for her despite the ache in his chest. "You'll make an excellent teacher." "Thank you," Florence replied. "I'm excited about the opportunity, but she sighed. "I've grown fond of Pinecrest, of the ranch. It will be strange to leave." Preston's hands tightened on the reins. "You'll adapt, you're good at that." "Yes, I suppose I am," Florence said quietly. When they returned to the ranch, they found an unexpected visitor waiting. Dr. Cooper from Pinecrest, his buggy parked by the barn. "Thomas," Preston greeted him with surprise. "Is everything all right?" "I'm afraid not," Cooper said gravely. "I came as soon as I heard. The Blackwoods know Florence is here." Florence felt the blood drain from her face. "How? Who told them?" "No one from Pinecrest," Cooper assured her, "but William Blackwood was in Clearwater yesterday. Apparently, someone at the school board mentioned their promising new teacher candidate, a woman staying with her cousin on a ranch near Pinecrest." "That could be anyone," Preston objected. "The description was specific enough," Cooper replied. "Auburn hair, green eyes, well-spoken." William put it together. "He's convinced it's Florence, and he's coming here tomorrow with the sheriff to reclaim his kidnapped fiancée." Florence swayed, and Preston steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "He can't do that," Preston said firmly. "Florence is a grown woman who left of her own free will. No crime has been committed." "I agree," Cooper said, "but the Blackwoods have the sheriff in their pocket, as they do most officials in the county. They're claiming Florence was coerced or confused, that you've been hiding her against her will." "That's absurd," Florence protested. "Of course it is," Cooper agreed. "But William is determined to save face. Having his bride run away was humiliating. He's convinced himself you must have been influenced by someone else." The doctor's expression grew grave. "I've come to warn you both. You need to leave tonight if possible. Once the Blackwoods arrive with legal authority, it will be too late." Preston's mind raced, considering options. "We could go north into Montana territory. I have a friend in Helena who would help us." "Us?" Florence looked at him in surprise. "Preston, this is my problem. You don't need to flee your home because of me." "If I stay, I'll be arrested for kidnapping," Preston pointed out. "And if you leave alone, the Blackwoods will eventually find you again." He turned to Cooper. "How much time do we have?" "They'll be here by noon tomorrow, from what I gathered," the doctor replied. "If you leave within the hour and travel through the night, you should have a good head start." Preston nodded decisively. "We'll need supplies, horses. Thomas, can you help us prepare?" "That's why I'm here," Cooper said. "I've brought some provisions and medicines, and I'll create a distraction in town tonight to keep attention away from this direction." As the men discussed logistics, Florence felt a storm of emotions. Fear of William finding her, grief at leaving the place that had become home, guilt for upending Preston's life, but beneath it all, a surprising flutter of hope. Preston had said us without hesitation. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Within the hour, they were ready. 2 horses were packed with essential supplies. Florence had changed into men's clothing for easier riding, her hair tucked under a hat. Preston had gathered what money he had, along with the deed to his property and other important papers. "I'll spread word that you've gone east," Cooper told them as they prepared to depart. "Should buy you some extra time." "We can never repay you for this, Thomas," Preston said, clasping his friend's hand. "Just stay safe," Cooper replied. "And perhaps name your first child after me." He winked, causing Florence to blush furiously. Preston cleared his throat, ignoring the comment. "We should get moving if we want to cross the ridge before dawn." With final thanks to Cooper, they mounted their horses and rode out, heading north through the darkness. Florence took one last look at the small ranch that had been her sanctuary, wondering if she would ever see it again. They rode in silence for several hours, keeping to less traveled paths, guided by the moon and Preston's knowledge of the terrain. When they finally stopped to rest the horses near a small creek, Florence voiced the question that had been troubling her. Why are you doing this, Preston? You're giving up everything, your ranch, your home. Preston was quiet for a moment, checking his horse's hooves by lantern light. A ranch is just land and buildings, he said finally. Can always find more of those. That's not an answer, Florence pressed. You're risking everything for me. Why? Preston straightened, meeting her gaze directly. In the soft glow of the lantern, his expression was more open than she'd ever seen it. Because I love you, he said simply. Have for months now. Probably since that first morning I found you making coffee in my kitchen, looking like you belonged there. Florence stared at him, momentarily speechless. I know my timing is terrible, Preston continued with a self-deprecating smile, and I don't expect anything from you. But if you're asking why I'm here, that's why. I couldn't let you face this alone. Couldn't bear the thought of you being forced back to Blackwood or trying to survive on your own. Florence felt tears welling in her eyes. Why didn't you say something when I mentioned the teaching position? I was hoping, I thought perhaps, that I'd ask you to stay. Preston shook his head. I wanted to, God knows I wanted to, but you deserved a choice, Florence, a real future, not hiding on my small ranch as someone you're not. And now, Florence asked softly, what future are you offering me now as we flee into the night? Preston stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. An honest one. I can't promise wealth or an easy life, but I can promise to love you, to respect you, to build whatever life we can together as equals. Florence reached up, touching his face gently. I've had wealth offered to me before. It came with golden chains. She smiled through her tears. I'd rather have freedom and your love than all the Blackwood fortune. Preston's arms went around her then, pulling her close. Are you certain? This won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is, Florence replied. Then she rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepened with months of unspoken longing. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, foreheads touching, reluctant to separate further. We should keep moving, Preston said regretfully. Still a long way to go before daylight. Florence nodded but stole another quick kiss before they mounted their horses again. As they rode into the night, side by side now rather than single file, she felt a lightness despite their precarious situation. For the first time in her life, she was traveling toward something she wanted, not merely fleeing something she feared. They reached the ridge just as dawn was breaking, pausing to rest the horses and themselves. From their vantage point, they could see for miles forests, valleys, and in the far distance, the jagged peaks of mountains still capped with snow. It's beautiful, Florence said, taking in the vast landscape. It is, Preston agreed, though he was looking at her, not the view. We'll need to be careful crossing into Montana territory. There might be patrols, especially if the Blackwoods alert authorities that we're heading this way. Florence nodded. How far to your friend's place in Helena? 3 days hard riding if all goes well, Preston replied. Jacob's a good man. Helped me get started when I first came west. He'll give us shelter while we figure out our next steps. And what might those be? Florence asked. I can still teach, perhaps. And you? Ranching's what I know, Preston said. But I can turn my hand to other work if needed. Montana's growing fast, plenty of opportunities for those willing to work hard. As they prepared to continue their journey, a distant sound made them both freeze. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming up the trail they just traveled. Riders, Preston said grimly, pulling out his spyglass. He focused on the distant figures, then his expression hardened. Blackwood men. 5 of them, including William and Turner. How did they find us so quickly? Florence gasped. Doesn't matter now, we need to move. Preston quickly gathered their things. There's a ravine about 2 miles ahead. If we can reach it before they spot us, we might lose them in the forest beyond. They mounted and rode hard, keeping to patches of trees and low ground as much as possible. But the terrain was working against them, increasingly open as they approached the ravine, offering little cover. They've seen us, Preston called as they galloped across an exposed stretch. A glance back confirmed his words. The riders had increased their pace, dust rising behind them. Florence urged her horse faster, fear lending her strength. The ravine was visible now, a deep cut in the earth with dense forest beyond, if they could cross it. A shot rang out, the bullet whistling past Florence's head. She ducked instinctively, nearly losing her balance. "Keep going," Preston shouted. "I'll hold them off." "No," Florence cried, but Preston had already reined in his horse, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "Get to the ravine," he ordered. "I'll be right behind you." Torn between fear and reluctance to leave him, Florence pressed on. The ravine was close now, the trail descending steeply toward a narrow bridge across the chasm. Behind her, Preston fired twice, forcing their pursuers to take cover temporarily. Then he was galloping after her, catching up as she reached the bridge. "Go," he urged, and Florence guided her horse onto the wooden structure. Halfway across, disaster struck. A board cracked beneath her horse's hooves, startling the animal. Florence struggled to maintain control as the horse reared, nearly sending her over the edge. In the confusion, one of their supply bags slipped free, tumbling into the ravine below. "Easy, easy," Preston called, dismounting and approaching carefully. He caught the horse's bridle, calming the frightened animal. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Florence gasped, heart pounding. "But the bridge, it'll hold," Preston assured her, leading her horse the rest of the way across. Once on solid ground, he quickly assessed their situation. The pursuers were closing in, less than half a mile away now. "The bridge," Preston said suddenly. "If we damage it enough, they won't be able to follow." Understanding his plan, Florence helped him gather rocks. Together, they worked frantically to weaken the bridge's supports, loosening key structural elements. "That should do it," Preston said as they heard the pursuers approaching the ravine's edge. "Let's go." They mounted and rode into the forest, following a narrow trail that wound through dense pines. Behind them came shouts, then a tremendous crack and crash as the weakened bridge collapsed under the weight of the first rider. Did they fall? Florence asked, horrified at the thought of anyone plunging into the ravine, even their enemies. "No," Preston replied, having glanced back. "The bridge gave way before they were fully on it, but they won't be following us across, that's certain." They continued riding, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the Blackwood party. By nightfall, they had traveled deep into the forest, far from any established trail. "We should be safe to rest here," Preston said, finding a small clearing beside a stream. "They'll have to go miles out of their way to find another crossing." Exhausted, they made a simple camp, not risking a fire that might be spotted. They shared jerky and hardtack from their remaining supplies, then settled beneath a shared blanket for warmth. "I'm sorry," Florence said as they lay side by side, looking up at stars visible through gaps in the pine canopy. "For what?" Preston asked, his arm around her shoulders. "For all of this. You've lost your home because of me." Preston turned to face her. "I meant what I said before." "Home isn't a place, Florence, it's people, it's you." She smiled in the darkness, curling closer to his warmth. "I love you, Preston Reid." "And I love you, Florence Hartley," he replied, kissing her forehead. "Now get some sleep, we've got a long journey ahead." The next morning brought renewed determination. They traveled steadily northward, avoiding settlements and keeping to wilderness when possible. By the third day, they were approaching Helena, the territorial capital bustling with the energy of a growing frontier town. "Jacob's place is about 5 miles outside town," Preston explained as they paused on a ridge overlooking the valley. "He has a good-sized ranch, raises horses mainly." "Will he really help us?" Florence asked. "We're bringing considerable trouble to his door." "Jacob's faced worse," Preston assured her. "And he owes me a favor or two." He smiled at her questioning look. "Story for another time. Come on, we should reach his place by nightfall." As they rode toward their destination, Florence found herself thinking about their future. So much had changed in just a few months. She'd gone from reluctant bride to fugitive too. What would she be in this new life they were creating? Jacob Miller's ranch was impressive, larger than Preston's, with several outbuildings, corrals filled with fine horses, and a sprawling main house. As they approached, a tall man with graying hair emerged from the barn, squinting at them before breaking into a wide grin. "Preston Reid, as I live and breathe," he called, striding toward them. "Been too many years, my friend." Preston dismounted, clasping the man's hand warmly. "Jacob." "Good to see you." "And who's this lovely lady?" Jacob asked, turning to Florence with friendly curiosity. "Florence Hartley," Preston introduced her, helping her down from her horse. Well, it's complicated." Jacob's eyes twinkled. "The best things usually are, come inside, both of you. You look exhausted, and Annie will have my hide if I keep guests standing in the yard." Inside the comfortable home, they were greeted by Jacob's wife, Annie, a robust woman with a quick smile who immediately bustled them toward chairs and brought coffee. Once they were settled, Preston explained their situation, omitting no details. Jacob and Annie listened without interruption, their expressions growing serious as the story unfolded. "The Blackwoods," Jacob said when Preston finished, "their reputation reaches even here. Harold Blackwood's been trying to expand into Montana territory for years." "Then you understand why we had to flee," Preston said. "If William had found Florence?" "Say no more," Jacob held up a hand. "You did right, and you're welcome to stay here as long as needed." "We can't impose indefinitely," Florence protested. "Nonsense," Annie said firmly. "We've plenty of room, and Jacob's been complaining for months about needing help with the new breeding program." Jacob nodded. "It's true. I could use someone with your knowledge of horses, Preston." "And Florence, Annie's been wanting to start a small school for the ranch children and others nearby." Preston and Florence exchanged surprised glances. "You're offering us positions?" Preston asked. "I'm offering you a fresh start," Jacob corrected. "With fair wages and the cabin by the creek to live in. It needs some work, but it's private and comfortable enough." "I don't know what to say," Preston admitted. "Say yes," Annie encouraged. "At least until you decide what you want to do long-term." Later that evening, after being shown to guest rooms, Preston found Florence on the porch, gazing at the stars. "What do you think?" he asked, joining her at the railing. "I think we've been blessed," Florence replied softly. "To find such kindness when we needed it most." Preston nodded. "Jacob's a good man. His offer is generous. Should we accept?" "I believe we should," Preston said. "At least for now, give ourselves time to build something of our own." Florence turned to him, moonlight silvering her auburn hair. "I've been thinking about us." "Oh." Preston's heart quickened at her serious tone. "If we're to start a new life here, I'd like to do it properly." Florence took a deep breath. "As husband and wife, if you'll have me." Preston stared at her, momentarily speechless, then a slow smile spread across his face. "Are you proposing to me, Florence Hartley?" she laughed softly. "I suppose I am. Terribly forward of me, isn't it?" "Terribly," he agreed, pulling her into his arms. "And my answer is yes. 1,000 times yes." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the local church, with Jacob and Annie as witnesses. Florence wore a blue dress Annie had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair. Preston, in his best shirt and new trousers, couldn't take his eyes off her as they spoke their vows. "I never thought I'd see this day," he told her as they walked back to their new home, the cabin by the creek, which they'd spent days cleaning and preparing. "When you first appeared in my barn, shivering in that wedding dress, I just wanted to keep you safe. Never imagined you'd become my wife." "Life has a way of surprising us," Florence replied, squeezing his hand. "I ran from one wedding only to find my way to another, the right one this time." As summer turned to fall and fall to winter, Preston and Florence built their new life on the Miller Ranch. Preston's skill with horses made him invaluable to Jacob's breeding program, while Florence established a small school that soon drew children from neighboring ranches as well. They worked hard, saved their wages, and slowly furnished their cabin with the necessities of a comfortable home. At night, they would sit by their own hearth, planning for the future, perhaps their own ranch someday, children. All the dreams they now allowed themselves to have in early spring. Nearly a year after Florence had fled her wedding to William Blackwood, a letter arrived from Dr. Cooper in Pinecrest. William Blackwood is engaged again, Florence read aloud to Preston. To Caroline Westfield, daughter of a banker from San Francisco, the wedding is set for June. Preston watched her face carefully. How do you feel about that? Florence considered the question. Relieved, mostly. If William has moved on, perhaps the Blackwoods have truly given up their search for me. Cooper seems to think so, Preston agreed. He says your name hasn't been mentioned in months. Poor Caroline Westfield, Florence said with genuine sympathy. I pray she fares better than I would have. Perhaps she will. People can change. But Preston didn't sound convinced. There's more, Florence continued reading. Your ranch was sold to the Hendersons last month. Thomas says they're good people who are taking good care of the place. Preston nodded, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Glad to hear it. The land deserves to be worked properly. Florence set the letter aside and moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. Do you regret it, leaving everything behind? Preston looked at her, his expression softening. Not for a moment. I gained far more than I lost. He placed a gentle hand on her stomach, where the first subtle signs of their child were just becoming visible. And our family is only growing. Speaking of family, Florence said with a smile, Annie invited us for dinner tomorrow. She says Jacob has a proposition for us. The proposition, as it turned out, was more generous than they could have imagined. Jacob and Annie, childless themselves and growing older, wanted to gradually transfer ownership of part of their ranch to Preston and Florence. The north section, Jacob explained over dinner. It's good land, water, grazing, timber, about 200 acres. You've earned it with your work this past year, and I'd rather see it in your hands than sold to strangers when Annie and I can't manage anymore. We can't possibly accept such a gift, Preston protested. Not a gift, Jacob corrected. An investment in the future. You'll continue working the whole ranch together with us, but that section will be yours to develop as you see fit. Build your own home there, run your own herd alongside ours. And the school can continue right where it is, Annie added, smiling at Florence. Those children need you. By summer, construction had begun on their new home, a sturdy cabin overlooking a meadow filled with wildflowers. Preston worked on it in every spare moment, determined to have it finished before winter and the baby's arrival. Florence divided her time between teaching and preparing for the child, sewing tiny garments in the evenings as Preston read aloud from favorite books. Their happiness was profound, but quiet, the contentment of two people who had found their place in the world together. On a crisp October morning, as the aspens glowed gold against the blue Montana sky, Florence gave birth to a daughter they named Prudence, Anne Reed Prudence for Preston's mother, and for Annie, who had become like a mother to Florence. She's perfect, Preston whispered, cradling his newborn daughter with hands that trembled slightly. She has your eyes. And your stubbornness, I think, Florence replied with a tired smile. She certainly took her time arriving. Preston leaned down to kiss his wife's forehead. Thank you, he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. For what? For running away. For hiding in my barn, for giving me everything I never knew I wanted. 2 years later, on the 5th anniversary of the day Florence had fled her wedding to William Blackwood, the Reid family stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching a spring sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. Preston held their son, Thomas Jacob, born just 3 months earlier, while Florence kept an eye on Prudence as she chased fireflies in the yard. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you'd married him? Preston asked quietly. It was a question he'd never voiced before. Florence considered it briefly. No, she said honestly. That life seems like a dream now, or rather a nightmare I woke from. She took his free hand, lacing their fingers together. This is the only life I want to remember, Preston smiled, raising their joined hands to his lips. No regrets then? Florence looked at their children, their home, the life they'd built together. Only that I didn't run sooner, she replied with a smile. I could have found you earlier. You found me exactly when you were meant to, Preston said. And I'll be forever grateful that a runaway bride decided to hide in my barn on the coldest night of the year. "As will I," Florence agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder as Prudence ran toward them. Hands cupped around a glowing firefly, her laughter echoing across the meadow like a promise fulfilled. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Preston and Florence Reid stood together, two people who had risked everything for love and found, in each other's arms, the home they'd both been searching for all along.